Right, I think we should begin, and hopefully anybody else can continue to join us as and when they're ready. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah McDougall, for anyone who doesn't know me, and I'm the director of Benary Gallery and Museum. Thank you very much for attending this first event in our new series of lectures, brought to you, like so much else currently, by the technology of Zoom. And thank you also for such an incredible turnout. I believe some 500 people have signed up for this evening's event, with our winning combination of our speaker, Rüdiger Görner, and his subject, Oskar Kokoschka. This evening's event promises to be a very special one and will be recorded, and hence we have asked you to kindly keep your microphones muted and your cameras turned off. This is just to lessen any possible interference. There will be an opportunity to turn your cameras on during the Q&A at the end. And if you wish to send me any questions near the end for our speaker this evening using the chat function, then please do so, and we'll try to fit in as many as we can in the available time. And so to our very distinguished speaker this evening. Rüdiger Görner is Professor of German with Comparative Literature and founding director of the Centre for Anglo-German Cultural Relations. Between 1999 and 2004, he was director of the Institute of Germanic Studies, where he founded the Ingeborg Bachmann Centre for Austrian Literature. His books include biographies of Rainer Maria Rilke and the poet Georg Trakl. He has published studies on Hölderlin's poetics, the Goethe Zeit, Austrian literature from Stifter to Thomas Bernhardt, Thomas Mann, and his notion of finality in culture, as well as studies on literary aesthetics. Professor Görner is a visiting fellow of the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science and held visiting professorships at the universities of Mainz, Hanover, Heidelberg, Vienna, and Salzburg. He is a member of various advisory boards of cultural institutions, publishing houses, and academic journals. As a literary critic, he writes for some of the leading journals in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, including Die Zeit, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Die Presse, and Neue Zürcher Zeitung. In 2012, he was awarded the Deutsche Sprachpreis of the Henning Kaufmann Foundation in Weimar. In 2012, he was Senior Research Fellow at the International Colleg Morphote of Cologne University. And in 2013 to 14, he held the Georg Trakl Visiting Professorship at the University of Salzburg. In 2015, he was awarded the Weimar Lust Prize of the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung. And in 2017, he received the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany in recognition of his achievements in developing Anglo-German relations. Tonight, as the author of an acclaimed new biography of Austria's most celebrated expressionist painter, Oskar Kokoschka, now available in an English translation, Rüdiger will explore Kokoschka's artistic and political position within the context of his years in Britain. Although Kokoschka played a major role in shaping European art in the 20th century and had an international reputation at the time of his first emigration to Prague, he was not yet well known in Britain upon his arrival in England in 1938. This fascinating lecture promises to throw new light upon his experiences, reception, and work, with particular reference to his impressions of London, his important portrait commissions, and his series of now celebrated paintings criticizing the Allies' unassertive response to Hitler's policy of aggression. Although we did not have a work by Kokoschka in the Benary collection yet, we are delighted to have exhibited his work on a number of occasions, including most recently at the exhibition Art Exit 1939, A Very Different Europe, shown at 12 Star Gallery in 2019. Kokoschka is one of the 902 subjects on Boro, our online database recording the Jewish and immigrant contribution to the visual arts in Britain since 1900. And I was fascinated to learn from Rüdiger's book that one of Kokoschka's early London addresses was at 17 Boundary Road, just a few doors down from Ben Uri Gallery. And now over to Rüdiger for the main event. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, for your very kind introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to be able to share a few thoughts on Oskar Kokoschka with you tonight at the occasion of the launch of the translation of this biography. It is a privilege indeed to do this in the context of the Ben Uri Gallery. I hardly have to tell you how significant, how important this institution has been and is to the very day. And I would also extend my thanks to the ladies in the background who have managed to work on the technical issues that enable us to share this evening. Also thanks, of course, to my English publisher, House Publishing, who have also been instrumental in supporting this event. Let's go straight to the matter. And the title, Oskar Kokoschka in Exile, of course, does suggest that we are only talking about a segment of his work. It can't be anything else, because the variety of what Kokoschka represents as an artist, what his oeuvre represents, is such that one cannot but segment, one cannot but select. In terms of labeling Kokoschka, which of course is a pursuit that all academics, all art historians and critics are keen to do, it is quite difficult to really call him an expressionist artist, or rather, he was an expressionist in the first phase of his career, very much in Vienna, in, shall we say, just before the First World War. This is where he contributes to expressionism, both as an author, a dramatist, and of course, as a painter. But his origins are not in that sense academic. They are what you would call nowadays in the applied arts. So he starts with an equivalent to what is known in this country as the arts and crafts movement. He comes from the Wiener Werkstätten, that is to say, he was interested right from the beginning to apply his skills, but also to refine his skills to the point that he will become one of the most important, often forgotten, illustrators, lithographs, producing lithographs for literary texts. This will start very early in his career with his own texts. And it will come to a climax, right, at the end of his career, when he illustrates, or rather produces illustrations to Kleist's Penthesilea play. Let's go to our first slide, please. I cannot resist to open this evening's presentation with a glimpse onto what Kokoschka saw in 1925, his very first visit to London. And obviously, when I speak about Kokoschka and Exile, I very much will talk about predominantly Kokoschka in London, also in Cornwall, also in Scotland. But what Exile means for him, we come to that in a minute. This here is a significant, what I would call a city portrait. Kokoschka, as we all know, was a great portraitist, and he treated not only human beings as objects for portraits, but also cities, cityscapes, so to speak. Likewise, in fact, animals. Also that is occasionally forgotten. Some of you will know perhaps his animal renderings of the mandrill and of the tiger lion in the mid of the 1920s, very much at this time when he came to London and resided where? Well, he resided in the Savoy. top floor, Savoy, was his atelier, so to speak, his improvised studio. He was able to afford this at the time, not because of commissions, but because of the salary he had earned in Dresden. Since 1919, he was in charge of the Dresden Academy. Now, what is so significant, what is so important about this first take on London, this first glimpse of London, as far as he was concerned, is of course the very position. I repeat, it is the top floor that he uses of the Savoy. He wants to be on top of things. He wants to be above, as it were, everything else. And in this case, even above the metropolis, London. This perspective from above down to a city, or onto a city, is something that he adopts pretty clearly around 1917, when he produced a first city painting in a, shall we say, more advanced sense of the word, of Stockholm. He was there in 1917, twice badly wounded in the First World War, but he was allowed to visit a clinic in Stockholm, a specialist clinic to mend, in inverted commas, his hearing, because in one of the infamous battles at the Isonzo River, the Dolomites, his hearing became very badly impaired. So when he goes to Stockholm, what he does, interestingly, he feels triggered, he feels inspired to look down upon the city. And this is exactly the view that we have also here with the London rendering of 1925. There's another such a painting a year later, but we can skip that. The next slide, please. We stay just a bit outside of London, as you will recognize. This is Richmond. It is Richmond Terrace, 1926. This is when he returned to London for a short while. And what is before us is the obvious, it is almost the constable view, so to speak. What is before us is a specific take on color. He will call this eventually, when he founds the School of Perception, the School of Seeing after the Second World War in Salzburg, he will call this the color perspectivism. And the color perspectivism is something that he develops here and will also retain, as we will see later on. In this case, the dominant color, obviously blue and green. Richmond Terrace, looking down onto the Thames. It is the Turner, it is the Constable view, as you will recognize. But the idea of color perspectivism is that the sheer depth of the painting is generated by a particular combination, a particular composition of color schemes. And in this case, we can call this very much a symphony in blue. Next slide, please. When I speak of color perspectivism, I should also introduce another concept of his, which is very important at the time. And this is the so-called bifocal perspective. The bifocal perspective is something that he will engage in when he begins his renderings of Prague. What is before you is, again, instantly recognizable, the Charles Bridge, 1934. And you can see on the slide on the upper left, there's a question, exile or not? From Kokoschka's point of view, yes, it was in fact his very first exile. The exile in Prague, exile being because he felt he had to leave Austria because of the political developments there. Austro-fascism was rife, and this is precisely what he wanted to leave behind. He felt threatened by this upsurge of fascism in Austria in 34 following, and the civil war scenario of Austria was precisely what he felt distinctly uneasy about. Now, he arrives in Prague. Prague provides him with, as it were, a homecoming, because on the paternal side, his family comes from Prague. He was the son of a quite renowned goldsmith at the time, and his grandfather was a goldsmith in Prague. So this homecoming is, in a sense, celebrated by a whole number of portraits of Prague. This is one of them. Again, color plays a dominant part in the sense that it generates a very specific form of perspectivism. The bifocal approach is something that he will experiment with in the next couple of years. He will stay in Prague until October 1938, and it is in Prague where he will meet his future wife, Olda. More of that very soon. The next slide, please. Talking about Prague, talking about the Czechoslovakia of the post-war period, post-First World period, means, of course, we have to talk about the first president of the Czechoslovak Republic, Tomáš Masaryk. Masaryk, an eminent intellectual, an eminent figure, before he became a leading politician and a very liberal mind, he, and indeed the first president in 1919 of Czechoslovakia, he was a professor of philosophy in Prague University. Incidentally, his doctoral thesis was on suicide. When you picture conversations, and there were several, between Masaryk and Kokoschka, who received this very honorable commission to portrait Masaryk, when you picture conversations between the two, it is not impossible that the subject matter of suicide played a significant part, because Kokoschka, as far as we can tell, as far as we know, contemplated at least twice suicide before 1935, in fact, before the First World War, and the fact that he decided to join the First World War, to become a conscript at his own expense, as it were, because he paid for a horse to join the cavalry in 1915, he saw going to war as a kind of collective suicide, as it were. And there is, however, another topic which they will have shared and probably discussed even more intensely. And this has to do with a figure that is sort of looking over Masaryk's shoulder. It is a memory of a great Bohemian intellectual, Comenius. Comenius, the 17th century intellectual of a truly European standing, someone who wanted to broker peace, the 30 Years' War, someone who felt that it was possible to capture the knowledge of the time in what he called the Orbis Pictus, a book full of pictures that would illustrate the knowledge of the time. This is, in fact, one of the first presents that the very, very young Oskar Kokoschka received from his father, a copy of the Orbis Pictus. Right to the end of his life, Kokoschka will claim that this book was, in fact, of formative influence on him. The conception behind this was, you can, in fact, see knowledge. It is not just something you learn in an abstract fashion, but there is a visual side to it. In the background here, as you would almost expect, you have Prague, you have the Hradčín, you have this extraordinary edifice that Rainer Maria Rilke, who incidentally adored Masaryk, Wilke became a Czech citizen in 1919. He called the Hradčin a spectacle, a theatrical spectacle in architecture. So this is a Rilkean aside here. But I really find it is important for us to appreciate the sheer skill, the sheer compositional skill that Kokoschka displays here, bringing together the memory of Comenius with the reality of this great politician and statesman. By the time he completed this painting, Masaryk was no longer president. He had retired in 1935. And there is a drawing, however, of Masaryk that was done at the end of 1935. So just at a threshold when Masaryk had reached that threshold retirement. In fact, 1 year after this painting was completed, Masaryk died in 1937. That is to say, the carving up of his state he would not have had to witness. This was left to Edward Beneš. Beneš, of course, a close collaborator to Masaryk, and in the first phase of Czechoslovakia, Beneš was the foreign secretary. So much for this episode, which is of course much more than just an episode in Kokoschka's life. This portrait is something one should not forget, especially because it is an imagined double portrait, so to speak, of two great minds, separated for about 300 years. The next slide, please. This takes us to a, shall we say, tragic episode in Kokoschka's life. Tragic in the sense that it will condition what he will be seen as in the German lands under Nazism, a degenerate artist. It is almost a moment of self-irony that Kokoschka produces this self-portrait. He was incidentally an obsessive self-portraitist with countless self-portraits, both in oil and in charcoal by him. But he calls himself, he labels this painting the degenerate artist. Perhaps you detect a slight sense of irony or self-mockery here. But what you also detect here is this very determined gaze. There is no wavering here. This is someone who says to the people who look at this painting, yes, if they call me a degenerate artist, so be it. And of course, it is done immediately after the infamous exhibition of degenerate art in Munich in the Deutsches Haus in 1937. Again, this is still done in Prague. The next slide, please. Now, this is, shall we say, a more gentle approach to portraiture. We have on the right, Olda Parkovska, the very young lady with whom Kokoschka falls in love, vice versa. She was a brilliant, young, aspiring lawyer. And you can see, as so often, Kokoschka, even in this portrait, is in the background. He is the upper right. And he likes to do this ever so often. Even if he portrays someone else, he is somehow there. He's somehow present. And of course, you have his future father-in-law, again, a highly respected Prague lawyer, Karel Parkovsky. Parkovsky and his wife will also be just about able to emigrate to Britain half a year after Olda and Kokoschka. It was in fact Olda who was the driving force behind this decision to leave Prague in October 1938. Kokoschka is, and I think we need to be aware of this, Kokoschka is very much, and you saw this also in this previous self-portrait of the so-called degenerate artist. He is disarmingly fearless. This is someone who somehow writes, or rather underwrites, the famous sentence by Nietzsche, live dangerously. Live dangerously could have been also Kokoschka's motto quite easily. He is evidently appalled by what he sees that the Munich Treaty of September 1938 brought. But he does not quite realize the imminent danger for the entirety of Czechoslovakia as a state. Olda does, quite clearly. And Olda pressurizes him, as far as one can tell, to leave with her to, well, where to? Paris was certainly on the agenda because Kokoschka knew Paris fairly well. But ultimately they decided on London simply because both felt it was a safer haven. The next slide, please. Arriving in London is something which I think we need to spend a little bit more time on because what is before you, the portrait of a young Englishman, Michael Croft, the son of Lord Croft, indicates that he, Kokoschka, accessed the establishment. You have Lord Croft in the background. You have something that could almost be a sphinx, but it's not a sphinx, it's simply a dog on the left-hand side. It is a setup that Kokoschka was to a certain extent familiar with. It is a setup that also Olda was familiar with because she belonged to the upper bourgeoisie in Prague. But this here, in terms of the British class structure, was certainly something that Kokoschka was not so intimately familiar with. He needed not that long to adjust to this. And a crucial figure in terms of introducing Kokoschka to this level, bearing in mind he was by then 54, was Fred Ullmann, the German Jewish writer and painter, artist from Stuttgart, who had married into the highest aristocracy. Namely, he married Diana Croft, and that was Michael's sister. Diana and Fred Ullmann played a very, very significant part in the very first month of Kokoschka's time in London. And their home, then in 47 Downshire Hill in Hampstead, became a hub of artists, exiled artists, majority in majority, but also, shall we say, a place where some of the English aristocracy could meet with the exiles, vice versa. And it was an extraordinary setup that you had in 47 Downshire Hill. So much so that Kokoschka felt initially quite at home there. There's evidence for this because when there was talk of founding an association of German exile artists, eventually it will be called the Free German League of Culture, where Kokoschka will be one of their presidents, together with Bertolt Viertel, Stefan Zweig and Alfred Kerr, the great critic. When all of that happened in Downshire Hill, Kokoschka used this address, which is extraordinary. He used this address as his sender address when he wrote to various people, including Albert Einstein. There is a letter that Einstein wrote to Kokoschka, and he addresses this to 47 Downshire Hill. The letter is written in March 1939, and it just shows right up to then, right up to March 39, there was this relatively close exchange between these two artists, Kokoschka and Ullmann. But this is more or less where things stopped, because we have a phenomenon that runs right through Kokoschka's career, his biography. He had problems with fellow artists, visual artists, that is. When I said earlier on, he was very keen to retain an upper hand when it came to the perspective onto cities in this case. The same was almost true when it came to, shall we say, artistic trends. He was keen to step aside, to stand aside, but standing aside meant to be above things. And he clearly felt at some stage that being together with Fred Ullmann, with this fellow artist, was just a touch too close for comfort. It is symptomatic, and this is, one could say, not exactly the most pleasant of his characteristics, that Kokoschka decided to exclude the very name of Ullmann and Diana Croft from his memoirs. His memoirs are a remarkable text by any standards, but their reliability, of course, like Alma Mahler's memoirs, is, shall we say, questionable. It is extremely well written, but the documentary value is problematic. And I think this is one piece of evidence for it, because he should have credited Ullmann with much, much more than with silence in his memoirs. Because this very portrait that is before you, the Michael Croft portrait, is in a sense Kokoschka's entrée billet, to use Heinrich Heine's famous phrase, into English society. And from then on, one can't really say he goes from strength to strength. This is not quite true, because from then on, he is at least more known than he was before in this country, but only amongst a small circle of connoisseurs. What Sarah said by way of introduction is absolutely to the point. Kokoschka, a highly known, a highly reputed artist on the continent, barely known in this country, certainly not in 38, 39 following. This changed slightly during the Second World War, but one only begins to really recognize Kokoschka in this country right at the end of the war, or rather up to the time just before he left England for Switzerland in 1953. So this portrait, yes, it is a stepping stone. We have afterwards a whole number of portraits where he portrays members of the aristocracy. But then there is a fairly lengthy period where he doesn't get commissions, where he really finds that also London becomes far too expensive for him. And we move to the next slide, please. This is just an example of still painted in London. This is still done in London, this painting here. It is Kokoschka looking towards not just Olda so much, but looking towards the female as such, as a source of inspiration. This is the kind of connotations we have even with Kokoschka in his late phase. The female is a prime inspiration for him. So in a sense, this is portrait, yes, but it is also the beginning of something he will entertain much more seriously during the Second World War, namely to work on allegorical paintings. What that means, we will find out in a few minutes. But let's continue first. The next slide, please. Interestingly enough, it is not quite clear whether this is painted shortly after his arrival in London, that is to say probably November 38, or just before he left Prague. He calls it nostalgia. He calls it nostalgia. He somehow tries to capture what he has to leave behind. And by the time, or by the very moment when the decision was taken by Olda and himself to leave Prague, this element of nostalgia gets, in this case, the upper hand. Again, we have him here almost, it's not a caricature, but he's just a quotation, as it were, of his face in the right-hand side. But what is again important, the perspective onto Prague, onto the river Moldau. The bifocal dimension is present, different color schemes for the sky. Something is perhaps on the left-hand side, something is perhaps brewing, not quite clear, but the sky itself, there is a bifocal dimension that somehow is mirrored also in the colors in the Moldau, in the river. So this is what he left behind. This is from his point of view, a legacy. The next painting, please. I am terribly sorry. Occasionally I see chat notes from participants. I will not be able to go to respond to them now. We will have time afterwards to discuss things and to go back to certain questions. Here, first of all, an apology. It is not the GSSR. Please delete one S. Of course, this is after 1946-47, when the label socialist enters the GSR. So this, of course, means the Czechoslovakian Republic betrayed. The Red Egg, 1941. This is an example of Kokoschka's political paintings, the political engagement in the midst of his exile time here in London. This is what I would call a, shall we say, allegorical, political allegorical painting. The Red Egg on this table, and of course it is the conference table in Munich, prior to the Munich Treaty. The egg is broken up. There is a partition going on. Everyone wants to have a share of it. You have Mussolini, you have Hitler, you have the French cat under the table, you have the English lion also in waiting. But the one thing and the tragic thing is, of course, the chicken. The chicken that has left this egg tries to escape. But of course, in this shape and form, it cannot possibly survive. In the background, you have, of course, Prague. It's a very, very striking statement on Kokoschka's part, where you can certainly recognize the real two culprits here. And as you know, famously or infamously, the Czechoslovakia wasn't even represented during these negotiations. 1941, that is to say, again, it's a looking back. It's looking back to what had actually happened and try to come pictorially to terms with what had happened, if that was possible at all. Next painting, please. Slight relief, so to speak, in between is Polpero, is Cornwall. I just wanted to show this to you because It is the very moment when Kokoschka will leave London with Olda, because Cornwall at the time was of course less expensive than London, and the artist's colony in Polpero was conducive to him. He spends a fair amount there. The style of painting begins to change. There is a sense of, shall we say, more simplicity that enters these landscape renderings, something that will also happen when he does drawings, in particular in Scotland. We have a number of pencil drawings from this period, simply because this is a phase when he cannot afford oil color. He has to use pencils, colored pencils. Next one, please. Again, Polpero, and you have once again the very stark blue that captures the eye. Think back to the Richmond Terrace, think back to the first London painting. This kind of blue has a great deal to do again with the color perspectivism. You see at least part of his cottage there in Polpero, and you see this crab. And the crab is a symbol, yes, it is a symbol, it is also an allegory, but of what? Of moving backwards in terms of our civilization in 1940? Is it because of the stark red of this? Is this already the portrait of a victim? Is this some form of destiny that is all upon us, where the crab is the largest element in this painting? It's something that also Kokoschka, even though he wrote about this painting, he left deliberately open. We see a figure swimming there in the foreground, almost in the middle ground rather, and perhaps this figure is just about reaching the shore, but perhaps potentially also sinking. Live dangerously indeed. Next one, please. Another of those allegorical paintings of the mid-Second World War period, remembering the Lorelai, remembering the Rhine, remembering a stream that has now almost only perverted figures. Lorelai in the foreground to your left is now a very old lady, disheveled. She is not the beauty anymore that can lure people, that can lure sailors or what have you. What you do have are figures that can hardly save themselves. They are drowning. They are drowning by numbers, so to speak. The Rhine is a menace. The Rhine is something that has gone out of control. Lorelai, in her old age, so to speak, still, in a sense, displays her spell and can cast her spell and cause chaos. The next one, please. We have yet another allegorical painting that is, shall we say, testimony to Kokoschka's pictorial remembrance. And he remembers the Anschluss. He remembers the Alice in Wonderland figure stands for Austria in that sense. The Alice in Wonderland, the Wonderland that is around her is chaos, is distraction, is annihilation, is of course a situation that is now also familiar to him when he looks back to London. It is a civilization in flames. It is a Alice that has been violated. Perhaps she wants to resurrect herself as a first aid nurse. As you can see, you can just about make out this Red Cross, but is it possible for her? Is it plausible? Or is she simply a doll-like figure now who cannot take part in history anymore because history around her is entirely in chaos? Next one, please. Ivan Maisky. The Ivan Maisky portrait is, by all accounts, the most important portrait that Kokoschka produced during the Second World War in London. Maisky, the Soviet ambassador to St. James's, an intellectual by any standards, someone who commissioned this painting. He is, shall we say, a figurehead for those who are rallying behind, shall we say, the Stalin skeptics. And what you have in the background is interesting. You don't have Stalin, you have Lenin. And it just shows that Maisky was much closer to, shall we say, the origins of the Russian Revolution rather than to Stalin's dictatorship. But you also have a globe. You have a globe in the background that seems to break up, as you can just about make out here. It's just about, it is, of course, the globe, the world is in danger, and this crack could widen. Maisky seems to reflect on all of this. It is a stunning piece of portraiture on Kokoschka's part. He got a fair amount of money for this commission. Interestingly enough, although he was by then not exactly affluent, he will donate this money to the care of the soldiers who survived Stalingrad. In fact, on both sides, on the German side and the Russian side, the Soviet side. We don't know whether this money really reached Stalingrad or not, the hospital there outside. But that's another matter. Once this painting was sold, that was another remarkable source of income, you would have thought. But Kokoschka does not keep all this money at all. He gives $4,000 of this amount to the Oskar Kokoschka Fund of War Orphans of all nations united in liberated Czechoslovakia. That is to say, this was an investment into the future. And he did found a Kokoschka Fund of War Orphans, and he did stipulate that once Czechoslovakia would be liberated, once the war was over, all those nations, cultures that would be represented in Czechoslovakia should benefit, or rather the orphans should benefit from this fund. Quite a remarkable, shall we say, social engagement that we have here. So, as I said, the Maisky portrait is testimony to his very, very strong political engagement at the time, which is distinctly on the left. He regarded at that time, undoubtedly, the Soviet Union as the only power that could really get Hitler down and liberate the German lands, Czechoslovakia, and perhaps the whole of Europe. His pro-Soviet leanings were highly controversial in the exile community. And he, as always, he would stand back and simply listen to all these things, but retain more or less his views. There's an interesting evidence which I would like to share with you. It is a foreword that he wrote for a collection of poetry published in 1943. And in this foreword, he argues that it will not be, his words, it will not be Wall Street or Threadneedle Street that will liberate Germany, but the liberation will come from elsewhere. As far as he was concerned, this would be the Soviet Union. He later corrected his views pretty drastically, but there you are. Incidentally, this particular phase is well documented. I've also tried to unearth a number of letters, notes that the Tate Gallery archive holds, Maisky's notes, and especially his wife's notes to Kokoschka that I have included in my book. Next slide, please. what we are fighting for, 1943 again. You have Hitler on the ground, as it were. You have the surroundings, which are very interesting to study in detail. We haven't got the time for that. I just want to point out two interesting phenomena. On the right-hand side, you have Candide, a bust, not so much of Candide, but of the author of Candide, namely Voltaire. The chief head of the French Enlightenment, Voltaire, somehow has the upper hand. He is not on his knees. He actually still is present in people's minds. The really surprising feature of this painting, however, is Gandhi. Right up on your right-hand side here, you can see Gandhi present, 43, as someone who is an onlooker to what is happening in Europe. This is an extraordinary, given the time, this is an extraordinary statement on Kokoschka's part. I don't have to interpret this, you can do this for yourselves. The statement is clear. There is someone watching what is happening in Europe, and perhaps ultimately this will be a beneficiary. Who knows, by 1943. Next one, please. As you can see, even after the Second World War, Kokoschka remains highly alerted to dangers that he himself thinks he can face easily, but he realizes that the dangers for civilization haven't ceased, haven't stopped with the Second World War. The releasing of nuclear energy is something that exercises his mind very dramatically. And it is the year when in this country, a monograph will appear on Kokoschka by Edith Herman. And she was for quite some time very close to Kokoschka. She also visited 47 Downshire Hill. She visited him, with him, Fred Ullmann. She knew his work very well. But the monograph caused immense tension between the two. As always, if you wrote about Kokoschka during his lifetime, that was problematic news, because he wanted to control what Herman was writing about him. There was only one exception. He was very pleased with the very early monograph on his works by Westheim. That goes back to the early 20s, but he is the exception. He was also honored with a portrait that he made of him. But 47 is, from his point of view, a very difficult phase where new orientation should take place in terms of his art, but also politically. He realizes that subscribing to the Soviet principle was not exactly the best idea. He realizes what has happened to his own Czechoslovakia. We have at the same time an intensification of allegorical paintings, allegorical compositions again in his oeuvre. This is the time when he will engage in looking back to Greek, in particular Greek mythology. This is when he will paint these huge canvases of Prometheus, of Herodot, the Roman historian of the ancient times. This is when he is interested in depicting scenes from the Iliad, etc., etc. So we have a modernist by default almost at this stage, someone who is very eager to look back, someone, however, who retains the sheer vivacity of color. That is a feature that he will never lose right to the end. Incidentally, the 47 monograph by Hoffman, sorry, Edith Hoffman, contains a foreword by Herbert Reed. And Herbert Reed, interestingly enough, the great art historian, Reed says in this foreword that Kokoschka reminds him very, very strongly of El Greco. Of El Greco, he calls him the modern El Greco, which is interesting. Not an expressionist, not someone who takes forward the legacy of expressionism any further, but someone who somehow translates also in terms of colors, in terms of subject matters, the suffering of humans. That is something, and of creatures altogether. Look at the lion here, is also affected by this release of nuclear energy. That is what matters to Kokoschka, also Reed believes. And I think he has a strong point, because one thing crops up at that time also, especially in his drawings, in his charcoal work, is the cross. The cross creeps back, as it were, and is present. You also had this already in this painting, What We Are Fighting For. Also there you have by the background, you have an allusion to the cross. Next painting, please. Obviously, we have to frame the London experience somehow. We started our investigation into the exile period of Kokoschka with a very early impression of London, 1925, you will remember. And now we conclude with 1954. This is 1 year after they decided to leave London for good and settle in Switzerland, settle at the Lac Léman, the Lake Geneva, in Vevey. And there you have his interest in the new construction of Waterloo Bridge. Anything that is new intrigues him. Anything that has to do with technique, with technicality, intrigues him. And again, you have this position looking upon London, upon the Thames. There are 3 paintings of the 50s, of the 54 series. So he extra came back, as it were, to London for producing this memory, this, or rather refresh his memory of what London is about, or was about, from his point of view. Right, I think that's where we come to an end. Yes, here we go. And thank you all very much for listening to this. I'm afraid it was perhaps a little bit long, a little bit overlong, but we'll have at least half an hour for discussion. And I'm in your hands, I'm in Sarah's hand.
Hello, thank you, Rüdiger. Fantastic talk. We covered so much ground, from Prague to London to Cornwall and back. I know there were a lot of questions coming in at the beginning. We muted the chat because it was becoming a bit distracting. So I am going to just turn to that now to put some of the questions that the audience have been placing here for you. Okay, so one of the latest questions is, what would you say is Kokoschka's place and contribution to 20th century art? Obviously, a large question, but if you'd like to tackle that one.
That is indeed a large question, but of course an absolutely essential one, because I said earlier on that it is frankly very, very difficult to pigeonhole him. It is difficult to really say that he made a significant contribution to expressionism or to a new form of historical symbolism, or a rejuvenation, as it were, of mythologies in the visual arts. I dare say, and this is also the point of my biography, of my study on Kokoschka, he is fascinating because we have him as an exponent of the sheer wealth of artistic expression in the 20th century. There is very little in his work that, shall we say, does not reflect trends of the 20th century, with one major exception, of course: Cubism, abstraction. This is exactly what he fought against. And the one thing, also one is told, the one thing you could not do in his presence, to even breathe the name Picasso. You could not allude to Egon Schiele. out of the question. These are things which have something to do with Kokoschka trying to be in charge of his own artistic agenda. He wanted to be seen as a solitaire. That is quite clear. He wanted to be seen as someone who stood on his own. And this is one of the reasons why he felt so distinctly uncomfortable in the presence of other visual artists. He portrays musicians, he portrays writers, no end. Wonderful portraits of a Pablo Casals, of the great cellist, of Yehudi Menuhin, of so many others, of writers and, you know, journalists alike. What I would say in terms of his position in the 20th century, he somehow recaptured the need to study the human form, the human being, to credit the human being, to credit the suffering of the human being, that it is worth of being portrayed. Portraiture really gains a new dimension in the work of Kokoschka. It includes himself. I mean, I kept saying it's the self-portrait that matters so greatly. And then, of course, you have the writer Kokoschka. And you have this peculiar interface, or rather intriguing interface, between what he wrote about and what he painted. I mentioned Comenius. Comenius is, from his point of view, not just someone who becomes an object for visual renderings. He writes a large-scale drama on Comenius. And he will write about Comenius at least for 25 years. The Comenius play comes to a close only in the early 1970s. And it is a preoccupation for him to somehow work on this interface of artistic expression, the written word, and of course the political statement. This is a distinctly politically engaged painter, as we've seen. The question mark behind the latter is when you look at Kokoschka after 1950, when he begins to accept that some of his gallerists were former collaborators with the Nazis. That applies to his main gallery in Austria, the Welz gallery in Salzburg. And his attitude towards Welz is problematic. Welz was one of those people who worked for Göring as someone who was sent especially to Paris after 1940 to assess artwork, assess in inverted commas. So that was then generously overlooked. But of course, Kokoschka is someone who is a man, as so many artists are, of course, full of inner contradictions. He would, on the one hand, say yes to his gallerist in Salzburg, to Welz, and at the same time would have no problems at all with engaging very actively with the communist minister for culture in Vienna after 47. So we have these extremes that he somehow, did he reconcile them in himself? He retained them. So I would say his contribution to 20th century art to retain extremes, to make extremes bearable, to make extremes visible, both in relation to humans and of course in relation to more remote subject matters, e.g. mythologies.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there if I may, just for a moment, because I have so many questions in the chat.
Sure.
We won't get to all of these, okay, somebody is asking why you refer to Kokoschka as the untimely modernist in the title of your biography.
Yes, the Untimely Modernist was a decision taken for the English edition. It is not in the German edition. Untimely, but it was in fact, if I remember this correctly, it was my suggestion, simply because he is in many ways, in a Nietzschean way. Nietzsche famously wrote Untimely Meditations in 1873. And Kokoschka, as we know, was an avid reader of Nietzsche. If you look into his library, you find evidence for that. Untimely because he is in many ways also anachronistic. He likes to go against the grain. He is engaged in so many ways, yes, politically hyper engaged. And at the same time, he will retreat into mythology. He will retreat into a world that was not a common currency, the world of Comenius. Comenius is not common currency at all. He will retain this idea of the Comenian, shall we say, principle of unifying Europe on the basis of education. It's an extraordinary text that Comenius wrote on the subject, and Kokoschka will subscribe to this. He does that during the Cold War, mind you. So this is extraordinary how often he really steps out of his time. He engages and steps out. So in a sense, in the subtitle would have been too convoluted then, he is the untimely artist, the untimely modernist, and at the same time he is the artiste engagé. He is the engaged artist as well. And yet another of his famous contradictions. But modernist he certainly was in all respects.
Okay, and I have a question here from Catherine of Bristol. I'm sorry I'm not giving everyone's names. Do you think Kokoschka's lack of widespread recognition in England during the war years can be blamed on what has been called an oscillation between Britain's excessive deference to Austro-German artistic tradition and defensive chauvinism? Or were his satirical paintings just not accepted or trusted by the art establishment?
I think the latter was certainly the case. The kind of allegorical portraiture, even the red egg, for example, that would not have gone down very well at all. I mean, even Herbert Reed, who was the most tolerant of them all towards Kokoschka, does not really comment on this. This is not the nice thing to do. And when you look at Kenneth Clark, for example, the then director of the National Gallery, he likes the Maisky painting very much. He even wants to keep the Maisky painting, but that's just about it.
He asked for the Maisky painting.
Interesting. Oh, well, there you are. But for the rest, even Kenneth Clark is very reluctant to embrace this kind of, shall we say, at times always slightly explosive form of modernism. There is an explosiveness in Kokoschka. There is this eternal swirl in his renderings and his treatment of color, for example. There is this dynamics which you don't have in the contemporary art world in Britain then. It is different. And interestingly also, when he's in Cornwall, in Polpero, St. Ives is not necessarily a place he will visit. He knows the setup in Hampstead, but he is very lukewarm about, shall we say, the representatives of contemporary British art in Hampstead. Yeah? So we have this reluctance also on Kokoschka's part to really fully engage in the artistic life in this country. So it works actually both ways.
Okay. Okay, so let's see. So somebody's asking whether you could, this is Glenn, reflecting on Kokoschka as a teacher and a draftsman, could you please tell us something about the distinctive role drawing will play in his untimely modern exilic estrangement? Thank
you for that question. It's absolutely crucial. What I think illustrates this untimely modernism in his drawings, for example, especially the charcoal drawings at the end of the First World War, is that he would take themes of Bach cantatas and make them a motif for his own suffering, to depict his own suffering. There is a famous charcoal drawing where he portrays himself just about peering out of a coffin, just about at the moment when he is likely to be buried, as it were. But this is an allegory on a Bachian cantata. I mean, if ever you have been untimely about, shall we say, a modernist interpretation of Bach, this is the example. When it comes to his drawings, when it comes altogether to the development of his drawings, the lithographs that I referred to at the beginning, they are quite characteristic for the way in which he engages with literature, as said. Something he will retain right to the end. The illustrations of Kleist play a significant part here, whereby he would always say, retain the human form. The human form must be still detectable, must not be, in his words, perverted. That is to say, he would demand, especially from his students in Salzburg, after he founded the School of Seeing, die Schule des Sehens, he would demand from them very, very quick sketches. Sketches have to be quick. There has to be this dynamics, which we have also in his color schemes, in the way in which he has swirls all the time in his paintings. You have the same thing in the drawings. Drawings must be done quickly. The eye has to be both precise and fast. The one thing he famously detests are photographs. The untimely modernist, here we have it. He is so untimely about, shall we say, the technical means that would be available to him, that he could use, that he could also perhaps talk about with his students. Never ever draw from photographs. This is one of his gospels, as it were. And there is no aid, so to speak, in terms of rendering what you see, except your pencil, except your charcoal, except your brush. And there is this other thing. It is a concentrated form of speed. This is not speed dating, but it is speed drawing, right? That's what he wants. That's quite essential, certainly also for Kokoschka after 1950.
And I know personally he did a fantastic series of lithographs on King Lear,
yes,
for example, and he very much what you were saying earlier, of this sort of identification. He identified obviously so strongly with Lear that he refused to do the blinding scene, presumably just, you know, he found it too terrible to do.
Indeed.
But,
Indeed.
immense work in the graphic form.
Yeah. But no Cordelia inside.
So Tessa here is asking, why did he choose to go to Polpero and who encouraged him to go to Cornwall?
Yes, in fact, it seems that he must have picked up somewhere that Cornwall was a place that would be conducive for his needs in terms of landscape, in terms of sheer material conditions. It is very likely, as ever so often, that Olda was the one who found out about the practicalities. By the way, this is someone who did not leave London because of any imminent danger. As I said earlier on, this man was truly fearless. And the one thing you would never do, you would never find Kokoschka in an underground station taking shelter during the Blitz. That is not his thing. He would in fact not go into any shelter, with one exception. When he married Olda, the wedding took place in Hampstead Tube Station, underground. That was the only time when he really decided, yes, it was perhaps a good idea to seek shelter. But other than that, no.
Okay, so Colin is asking, was he religious? The nuclear painting clearly features a Virgin and Child with other references to Christianity.
A very difficult question. One would have to, frankly, spend a whole lecture on this subject. One could easily. He was religious in a non-conventional sense of the word. His upbringing, yes, was distinctly Catholic. Born in Pöchlan, in the Upper Austrian provinces. One of his very first paintings, where he branches away, where he moves away from the arts and crafts movement, is interestingly a Madonna. It's the Lassinger Madonna. The Lassinger Madonna is an example where he really, one can say, yes, I mean, he was in a sense religious. His upbringing also included then in Vienna that he became a choir boy. And one of his pivotal moments in the early development of his life was to look up to a ceiling in a church in Vienna. He was singing in a choir. And what did he see? He saw a ceiling that was painted by Maulperch. Maulperch, one of the late Baroque Rococo artists, who had an extraordinary style by the standards of his time. If I ever would have to say anything about Maulperch, I would also call him an untimely modernist. Modernist at the time. Untimely in the sense that he broke through the sheer beauty, the coherent forms and shapes of the Baroque completely and utterly. He breaks up form. And that is something that intrigued already the young Kokoschka. And yes, you have certain motifs, I would almost say relicts of faith, of Christian faith, in his paintings, in the Bach cantata cycle, in the use or usage of the cross. Yes, you do. But nothing at all in terms of conventional religious, shall we say, beliefs. He is not a Chagall by any means, even though he shares the favoring of the blue.
Okay.
But that's where it stops.
Thank you. Fran is asking, from your research, who did Kokoschka engender, help or support while in the UK, please? I think she's asking which other artists and figures did he help or support while he was in Britain?
Yes, I'm afraid we are back to the problem that fellow artists were not quite his thing. He does support artists when they were remote. There was, for example, a Oskar Kokoschka Bund, which existed before, even before he left Prague. And he supported those artists of which he hardly had any knowledge. The less he knew about an artist, the better. And when he was a recipient, which is very interesting, when he himself was a recipient of a large sum of money bequeathed to, or rather given by the young Ludwig Wittgenstein to artists in need in 1914, he was a recipient of monies from the Wittgenstein money from Wittgenstein's father, but no other fellow artist. And that again, he seemed to have influenced somehow, because there was the contact with Ludwig von Vicker in Innsbruck, who was more or less in charge of distributing this money on behalf of Wittgenstein. Who else got that money? Georg Trakl and Rilke. Yeah? But no other artist, I'm afraid.
Okay. Somebody else, Philip is asking, which artists, not living ones presumably, did he admire, as you've already pointed out?
Yeah, I mean, it very much, I would really say Maulperch figures significantly. Then there is definitely a strong influence for a time from Böcklin. He is, interestingly enough, he was quite keen on Böcklin. The Romantics play a surprising part in his preferences, but the main influence, I dare say, by and large, the Baroque artists. Rembrandt features also in his aforementioned play on Comenius. Right at the end of this play, we have an encounter between Comenius and Rembrandt. He was very taken, as so many, with Rembrandt's use of light. You then have, and again, the untimely modernist. He blends the Baroque with modernism. That, I think, is the real achievement.
Goodness me, there's so many questions. I'm sorry, everybody, that I can't read them all, and some are very, very specific. So Rachel is asking whether you have any comments on the biography of Kokoschka by fellow emigre J.P. Hodin from 1966. Did he approve of that one? I know you've mentioned Edith Hoffman had difficulties.
Yes. The Hodin biography he did approve. I can cut this very short. Yes, he did. He was very happy about this. Yeah.
Good. Somebody else asks, why is the egg red in the red egg?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Why is the egg red? Because of the danger, the menace, the potential disaster. This is a signal color of the highest order. The redness is it is blood. It is blood. It is a kind of concentrated blood, as it were. And out of this egg, only this poor featherless chicken can emerge. There's absolutely no chance of surviving. It is, the red egg is death, in short.
Very decisive answer there. Okay, we'll just see if we can just fit in one or two more. I'm just going up to the top of the chat to see. Ben asks, do you believe Kokoschka's The Crab is an allegory for Neville Chamberlain's lack of involvement in the Czech occupation? Is there much weight to this argument?
He was absolutely furious about appeasement. Yes, that was something which he felt was entirely wrong. Again, a very short answer to this question. It is part and parcel of his, shall we say, agenda that he pursues also just before he left Prague. Appeasement is just about the last thing that he feels should have happened versus Hitler. He shares entirely the views, as it were, at the time of Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann in Exile will fire one letter after the next, one essay after the next against appeasement. And the relationship between Thomas Mann and Kokoschka, this is something which I've tried to explore also in the book. Very intriguing, very interesting. But those of you who are more interested in this side of things, please also have a look at Thomas Mann's, shall we say, laudatory essay on Thomas Masaryk, on the Czech president, which he wrote in 1937. It's a very fine piece of a necrologue, so to speak, on Thomas Mann's part. In that respect, both saw eye to eye.
Thank you. And I think we'll conclude with one final question. So let's see. Trevor asks, who did he think was the audience for the allegorical paintings? I wonder whether he did them for an audience or did he do them for himself?
This is also a very important question. He never thought of an audience, never ever. He thought, as far as one can tell, from his letters, from his correspondence, from his notes, I never found real evidence that this is someone who really tries to perhaps play to the gallery. No. The audience is only clear when he produces portraits. That's fine. When he's commissioned, fine. But this is one person. These are two persons, perhaps the family of the portrait figure. But when it came to the large-scale allegorical paintings, an audience he is not really thinking about. He wants to, yes, he wants to be educational in what he says, in what he does. In many ways, he wants to educate the eye. But the actual people that he wants to motivate, or wants to shock, or wants to really educate, this is not clear at all. This is not clear at all. As I said, if he has a commission, then we know. If not, he paints as the best writers do the same thing. They write for themselves. And he painted in so many ways for himself. Hence, he can also afford to take center stage, always, in the self-portraits.
You can't say fairer than that, and that seems a very good place to end. So I'd like to thank Rüdiger very much for a wonderful talk. I'd also like to thank Camilla and Manai, who are hiding up there, but have been doing a fantastic job behind the scenes with technical support for this evening. And I would like to thank Asha Astley of House Publishing for initiating this event. And I'd also like to thank everyone in our virtual audience. We were really overwhelmed by the support for tonight's event, both in people signing up and in your generosity in making donations to help the work of Ben Uri. As many of you all know, we've been closed, our physical gallery has been closed in St John's Wood since last March. We hope to reopen in June with a groundbreaking exhibition on Gustav Metzger. We hope that lots of you will be able to join us for that, and there will also be an online Zoom conference. But once again, thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and many thanks to our fantastic speaker, Rüdiger.
Thank you all. Thank you so much indeed. All the best. Stay well.
Stay safe, everyone. Yes.